Good evening, everyone. Welcome again to our beautiful Anderson Hall. Isn't this wonderful? I'm Sally Wren, and I'm chairman of the Diversity Awareness Group, and it is a pleasure to have all of you here tonight. And one of our members, Joan Singler, has brought us this wonderful, rare group from the Roosevelt High School to speak to us. So Joan will introduce our guests. Thank you, Joan.
Praise our indigenous.
Oh, thank you. I'm
Joan.
sorry. Joan reminded me I always like to open my meetings and here with honoring all those who have gone before us and cleared our path, but especially the Duwamish, upon whose land we now stand. Thank you, Joan.
Thank you, Sally.
So if there is anyone who cannot hear me,
Take your mask on.
that helps. All the wrinkles fall out when you take it off. If there is anyone here that cannot hear me, please raise your hand. I wear hearing aids and I'm hard of hearing, and it's most frustrating to go to something and miss every other line. Good evening and thank you all for coming out tonight. We have a really great program. Okay, so this program has been planned for almost a year, and so tonight I'm really happy to be able to share it with you and introduce our two speakers tonight. Joe Hunter and our other speaker is Tony Allison. So this is just going to be a short introduction because we're going to watch a documentary that lasts 30 minutes and I want you all to stay awake. I'm going to start with Joe Hunter, who is a native Seattleite, and as a teenager, he was one of the voluntary transfer students to address the racial segregated schools in Seattle. That was 1968. He's a native Seattleite, and once he got to, is it Roosevelt or Roosevelt? Roosevelt High School. He and Tony became teammates when they were both playing varsity basketball. They both graduated in 1971, and from there, Joe went on to earn a degree in business administration from Western Washington University. He has held several executive level management positions in merchandising, operations, and human resources, and was a field consultant for several large corporations. He also served on the board of the Orange County Urban League and on the board of the University of Illinois School of Business. Before COVID, Joe was a basketball coach at Seattle's High Point Park Department program. He is retired and lives on Beacon Hill with his wife, Rita, and two, well, I don't know that the children live there, but anyway, he lives on Beacon Hill. In 2020, he and Tony Allison became co-chair of the Roosevelt Alumni for Racial Equity. And tonight, you'll see and hear Joe in the documentary film. Now living on Weymouth Island with his wife and 3 children, Tony Allison was also a graduate from Roosevelt High School in 1971. While a student, he played varsity sports and made lifelong friendships. But he was also aware and concerned about racial injustice and the challenges of segregation being raised locally, nationally, and especially in the South in the late 60s and early 70s. Tony went on to attend Williams College, where he received a degree in history and Russian, and then completed his master's degree in international studies at the University of Washington. He first tried a business career, but ended up instead as a high school history teacher. He made sure, because of his past concerns, that his history class would include curriculum of history of slavery and race. In 2020, like many of us, the murder of George Floyd shocked both blacks and white, and we were questioning, how do we address the issue of racism in this country? Many of us demonstrated in the streets. Some of us went to a nearby street corner and held signs. Tony was motivated to contact his old basketball teammate, Joe Hunter, and these two men started a discussion group on racial issues that grew into the Roosevelt Alumni for Racial Equity. The 30-minute documentary film, Roosevelt High School, Beyond Black and White, which you will see tonight, is the result of that group trying to bring about change. After the film, both Tony and Joe will be up here with some comments and then open the floor for questions. I know I have a lot, so push the button to start the film, right?
Yay! Holding up the hold up the freedom banner.
There's so many ways that racism and inequity and privilege show up in our system, and we've gotten really good at disguising those ways so that it doesn't sound offensive.
We're basically having a performance, a race dance. And I think Seattle's a place that has a race dance, where they don't actually talk about the issues in the most critical ways that matter.
If we really want our kids successful, they're going to need the skills that we teach them here about race and equity.
What happens when race really comes up in our classrooms? Mostly we have white students getting really uncomfortable.
We have a super segregated city, and it's created a bubble in the north end of whiteness and privilege.
And it's not that the system's broke. It was designed to work that way against you.
It's been more than 50 years since Seattle first tried and failed to integrate our schools. At Roosevelt High School in Seattle's predominantly white North End, the more things have changed, the more they have stayed the same.
We're getting ready to celebrate our 50th high school reunion. And a lot of the issues that we've been talking about are same issues that we were talking about 50 years ago.
We went to high school during a time of tremendous racial upheaval. We thought there was progress made. And we're suddenly basically hit over the head with this idea that this is the situation.
How long can you be peaceful when your people are dying?
And how could that not divide the country?
In some ways, there have been tremendous strides. On the other hand, I still remember debating the Kerner Commission report that we're moving towards two nations, separate and unequal. In that sense, I feel that we've slid backwards.
It's just causes this, I don't know, like a thorn in my heart.
I have not seen anything that is more powerful at curing social problems. You know, poverty, healthcare, so on and so on and so forth. Education, independent of its ability to create wealth and income, serves people positively. Given finite resources, which is true, what's the best way to help black people in the city? I can tell you one thing, it's the schools.
So I remember Joe as a little guard, very quick, with a shot that he had a lot of confidence in, but it didn't always go in. But he had the confidence.
I knew Tony more from the outside because he was a star. It was obvious that a lot of those players on the team knew each other and had played with each other before, and I was kind of like an outsider. We played basketball together, we practiced together, then we went home. We went to our different directions.
Joe and Tony sharing a court today is not extraordinary, but it is only because of a decision in a different court that they even went to the same school. In 1954, the Supreme Court decided that racially segregated schools were unconstitutional.
We had been taught in school that we were a nation under law, and the law said segregation was wrong.
In parts of the country, especially the South, this led to white outrage and violence.
Hatred is easier to organize than understanding, and there was a minority in our state who found it to their advantage to bring hate to Little Rock in 1957.
It was ugly, in-your-face racism, and schools were dragged into integration, kicking and screaming.
I don't know why they let people like him go to our school anyway, and I'm not the only one. My folks...
In the North, people did not want to confront the problem.
The feeling in Seattle was that that was an issue that the South needed to deal with and not here in Seattle.
Lawsuits were filed across the country enforcing integration through busing.
Seattle didn't really want to confront busing, but it knew it was there as a real threat.
In order to avoid an NAACP lawsuit, Seattle tried a half measure, the Voluntary Racial Transfer Program. In 1968, Leah began riding a bus from the Central District to Roosevelt.
First, I want to talk about why I went to Roosevelt. It was not my idea. I came home one day in 9th grade, and my parents said, "You're going to Roosevelt." It's like, what? No one consulted me.
I signed up for the voluntary transfer program because my friends were going there.
My parents felt Garfield, the central area, which was really the war zone, was not safe because back in those days, I had to walk to school and I had to walk through those neighborhoods.
We knew we were the pioneers. I would say we were on the defensive end when we got off that bus that first day.
My first day was a jumble. I mean, it's 10th grade, you're the new kids. I can remember in my English class, there was a guy from Windermere who wouldn't sit next to me and scooted his desk as far away as possible.
One day, a couple of us were walking down the hallway and we noticed these sayings on the water fountains, coloreds and for whites only. It was straight out of Mississippi or something.
All the black kids were in the back of the bus and all the white kids were in the front. I realized part of that just the accident of how we got on, but there was basically no mixing.
I really didn't know I was a minority until I was, bused out to Roosevelt High School.
It was very clear when you walked into the lunchroom, there was a black table, maybe a couple black tables in a sea of white kids.
It was during lunch because we had to take a break, just like a coffee break to have coffee. You need to have that race break.
When I got to Roosevelt, there were larger numbers and larger numbers of black kids I got to know, particularly play sports with. And I still only had a vague sense that they came from the central area, and that they had to ride a bus usually there and back each day, and had to cope with a hugely predominant white culture.
I even started to wear loafers.
The voluntary racial transfer program didn't achieve its goals of integration. At its peak in 1970, the vast majority of students who participated were students of color. White kids were not getting on buses. So in 1978, the Seattle School Board implemented the Seattle Plan, mandatory busing throughout the district.
There was no violence. There were no mass demonstrations. The school desegregation plan started without a hitch.
So I was in the mandatory busing program of the late 70s into the early 80s. So I left the Central District where I was born and raised, and had to go to school in the North End at Roosevelt. Basketball at Roosevelt really cut down the color line for me, for sure. And possibly every young black man, young black woman that played on those teams. When we got to that gymnasium, the color went out the window, where you came from went out the window. You were just on that court together with that ball and that basket, trying to put buckets in.
When I came to Roosevelt in '58, I think there was one black student in our school at the time. Bringing in somebody as a freshman and just saying, well, here you are. And we've got 2,000 white students here and there's 4 black students. I didn't realize the problems they faced coming here every day. They're getting up at 5 or 6 a.m. to take a bus all the way here, and we gotta go over backwards to try to help in any way we can.
In the 1980s and 90s, the student population at Roosevelt was the most integrated it would ever be.
10 years ago at Roosevelt High School, this would have been an unlikely scene. 10 years ago, 90% of Seattle's public schools were mostly white or mostly black. Now, all but 15% are integrated.
So to talk about whether the busing program worked or not, you have to figure out what it means by worked. What were the goals? Did it achieve its goals? For me, if that hadn't happened, in those years, it would have been virtually an all-white school.
Voluntary busing program, again, from my perspective, was a success, largely because of Tony and I sitting here today and talking.
I was able to go to different homes of kids that didn't look like me, experience different things, take that home and have conversations with my grandparents and my parents and the kids around the neighborhood. If I hadn't gone to Roosevelt or I hadn't gone to school in North End, period, I would have never known about celery and peanut butter.
It was the Wizard of Oz experience that I know what the man in the booth looks like. I know how they live. I know what they eat at dinner. So in that sense, Roosevelt prepared me to be very comfortable at a place like Harvard or Princeton, or to be a lawyer.
While busing created opportunities for some students, much of the burden of busing fell on families of color.
I don't believe that busing was a failure or a success. I just believe it was. Some of us came out ahead, and I think that some of us didn't.
So it breaks up the neighborhood concept, it breaks up the family concept, and that's another reason why I was against it.
That community's gone, and it's never coming back. And that could have been one of those direct effects.
I actually have a lot of family members who were like on those same buses, and you know, it was still hard because you were still going to a space where, you know, even though like you were accepted, you weren't really accepted. Like if you don't feel welcome, you're not going to want to learn, you're not going to be paying attention.
At the same time, white parents reacted by pulling their children out of public schools. Within the first 4 years of mandatory busing, white student enrollment dropped by 34%.
White parents can escape integrated schools. It's easy to do. And that would be a failure of busing.
I think in the North, busing became a code word for integration. Like, there are schools in this region that opened up as a response to busing. You know, in the South, they call it segregation academies. We don't call them anything in the North, but they exist here. Now, they might not be segregating now, but they were opened up to avoid integration of schools.
With disintegrating public support, dwindling resources due to white flight, and a lack of tangible results, the school board voted to end race-based busing in 1996. Other efforts to integrate the schools were met with more litigation. Another decade of lawsuits culminated in a Supreme Court ruling, which was the final nail in the coffin for Seattle's attempts at integration. So where does that leave our schools today?
As we think of the history of busing and integration in our schools, that has led us to the educational landscape of where we are today, from my experience, our schools are less integrated now than they have been for decades. We have the 5th worst opportunity gap in the entire country, yet we are one of the fastest growing economies. There's no mistake that in all of this growth, that many communities, especially the ones that look like me, have been left behind.
Of all the barriers to equity, the most fundamental may also be the most profound. Our schools look like our neighborhoods, and the way our neighborhoods look is no accident. Etched deep in the map of Seattle is a history of redlining and racist property covenants. These restrictions extended to African American, Asian, Native, and Jewish people. Until 1968, it was legal to discriminate against people of color in Seattle when renting apartments or selling real estate. We didn't adopt an open housing ordinance until after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated.
We were the last city to adopt an open housing ordinance. That's kind of sad for a city that prides itself on being progressive. We were the last ones.
Leah grew up in the central area as far north as redlining permitted the vast majority of black people to live. Now she owns a house 3 blocks away from where her white grandparents used to live in Ballard.
So the greenhouse is where my grandparents and my great aunt and uncle lived. We were not allowed to come up to the house. They didn't want the neighbors to know that their great nieces were black. I think the results of redlining are baked into Seattle. I think because we use busing as the Band-Aid to not face redlining, we never really dealt with it.
When we stopped busing kids out of their neighborhoods, school populations reverted to divisions rooted in racism and economic disparity. What is really troubling is how much inequity within our public system this creates.
It's not some magic that happens by putting a black student and a white student in the same classroom. The real issue is how do resources flow throughout our district. And historically, what our data has shown us is that resources in a disproportionate way follow white students as opposed to other student groups.
The difference between North End and South End schools, and as it correlates with race, is that those kids in the South End feel that they are disenfranchised, that they are the bottom of the school district's plan.
Students shouldn't have to worry about like where they live to get like a better education. It should be the same for all students. You walk into Roosevelt and you're automatically expected to go to a 4-year and graduate. But you walk into Cleveland, especially if you're a black student, and you're just expected to survive.
It's almost like there's 2 different school districts.
If we were to look at all the high schools in Seattle, you could look at the average amount of experience for teachers. I can tell you something, Southside teachers have less experience. Another thing you could do is look at PTA and foundation funds.
I've been to some fundraisers and galas and things like that have been sponsored by PTAs, and you think that it was something out of The Great Gatsby, where I'm oftentimes at events on the South End where families are bringing food that they've made at home from potlucks and things like that. This is all happening within the same city, within the same 5-mile square radius.
And what's going to happen? You're just going to create some sort of disadvantaged at some level.
So many programs are now parent-funded that a wealthy school like Roosevelt has a really great band and other schools don't.
There is a tremendous amount of inequity between PTSAs in terms of how much money they bring to their schools. Absolutely. Is there a way to solve that? Maybe. We could pool all our funds and we could distribute them equitably. There is, however, this internal drive in people that they want to support the school that their children attend. And so as long as we segregate our neighborhoods into wealthy and less wealthy, that's going to be the end result.
Roosevelt has long had a reputation of privilege and influence and legacy. And I think a lot of those things, those are words that we use to be complimentary of an institution, but I think that a lot of those words are grounded in institutionally racist ideas.
Today in Seattle, inequity doesn't sound like this.
I don't know why they let...
It sounds more like this.
Okay, I hear you. Oh, totally, we definitely can help you. Like, here are the steps. And then you walk out and you like never hear from them again.
Seattle nice is real.
I think Seattle has a very, very subtle racism that is out every day. And you have to be aware of it and see it when you travel through the streets.
A lot of people say like, oh, Seattle is one of the most progressive cities. We're so progressive. But, you know, you have students on top of students and in front of school boards just fighting just to get their school renovated.
Going to school in Oklahoma, when I saw racism, it was right in my face. So I saw people that didn't like me for my color, my skin, and they would let me know. In Seattle, it's walking by a car and the door gets locked, or it's walking in the grocery store and purse is clutched.
White people in Seattle, and particularly in the North End, where you have a lot of economic privilege alongside racial privilege, it's all good and inclusive until the moment that it impacts them.
You're saying one thing to the public at large, like, don't mess with my schools, don't bring those kids here, don't do this, don't do this.
White parents have absolutely had an outsized voice in terms of advocacy in the school district. The consequences of listening to one subgroup at the detriment of other groups is clear in our opportunity gap. It's clear in our graduation rates. It's clear in the way that we offer and provide services throughout our district and how our systems are set up at every level of government.
Big picture inequities show up as everyday realities in hallways, in classrooms, in cafeterias.
The black people sit all on one table, and then the Asians will sit at one table, and all the white kids would be sitting like at one table. I feel like it's like the same story, like nothing changed.
I was hanging out with my friends and white friends, and there was a group of black students, and they noticed me and they said that I wasn't a real black person. So that kind of was just like a shock to me. I never heard anyone say that to me, and I am insecure, about my race being mixed is just very strange because you don't know where to fit in.
I was taking ESL the first year, but I didn't get along with the teacher because she was saying some stuff about how the black people don't live in North Seattle because they can't afford living here. That's one of the reasons that I'm doing Running Star. Because it's like I don't feel safe at that school and I don't have anybody to talk to about stuff I'm going through.
Being like a black student or a student of color, like there's already like structural barriers that get in your way. So on top of all that, just like walking into a classroom and just wanting to learn and having somebody, especially somebody that you're supposed to trust to teach you, look at you with like a presumption of guilt or look at you, like, oh, you're not gonna make it through this class, you're not gonna learn. When that constantly happens, you have that sense of like self-doubt over and over again, and then it just deteriorates your education.
When you walk in the door, like, are these white students, are they gonna be racist to me? And what am I gonna do about it?
Issues of race at Roosevelt and other Seattle schools reach far beyond black students to all students of color. The Roosevelt High School community has launched multiple efforts to address these issues. In every conversation, student voice is critical.
This is a space where the younger generation is going to teach the older generation things that they didn't learn in school.
I came into Roosevelt with the mindset that things needed to change.
Leah Scott wanted to be part of that change, so she pursued student government at Roosevelt. As a sophomore, she was elected class representative.
I had noticed that the discussions we were having were mostly about decorations, mostly about hanging signs, putting those little handprints you see on the pillars, a lot of these just posters and stuff, and talking about, oh, what decorations are we going to put up for Black History Month? Decorations are great, but what are they doing to help the communities within Roosevelt? There's performative and there's actual performative. And I like to kind of break it down that way because I think it's a good way to do it.
What comes to mind immediately is social media, since students use it to reach out and communicate with one another, and a lot of kids might use social media for performative things to show their support for a cause, which can be good and helpful, but also if that's the only thing you're doing, I think it's not gonna help. You have to talk to people and learn things, and that is what helps real performative change.
Racial equity work forced me to stay alert and just not shy away from the fact that there's racism that exists.
There's some kids who are super mad about racism, and I think rightfully so. And there are some kids who deny that systemic racism exists, or they've never had to think about it before. And the racism comes from ignorance. There are so many students here who live in a bubble and only interact with students just like them.
So when race comes up in a discussion, I think that a lot of kids aren't comfortable discussing it.
People don't really take the time to kind of push through this awkwardness and really have that deeper conversation. And to do that, you need to recognize the importance of it and the importance your role has in it.
If you're white, you should have to feel uncomfortable talking about racism because you experience a level of privilege. It doesn't mean that you haven't had a hard life, but it means you haven't experienced this specific hardship, which is very impactful.
The issues being confronted in the halls of Roosevelt are playing out across the country. Today's environment is profoundly divided.
I think for me what's at stake is the country.
The Confederate flag flew in the US Capitol. This feels very disconnected from what happens at Roosevelt, but it's a very similar issue. If we don't fix what's happening in our community at Roosevelt, in 20 years, when people are older and they are more powerful and they've been more entrenched in their views, terrible things can happen, like what happened on January 6th.
I think my grandchildren's stability, sanity is at risk.
Unless we figure out how to move forward as a collective society, then we are in grave danger of losing all of the values and all of the ideals that we as Americans hold dear. And it starts in every single classroom in this country.
If you look at the demographics of people, let's say 14 to 18, it's very diverse. If we're preparing students for the future society, they need to be able to talk about race. They need to be able to talk to people with different ethnicities than themselves, different genders than themselves, different orientations than themselves. And that needs to be explicit within the classroom.
If you come out of high school and you're white and you think that racism won't affect you, you're wrong. And I think it's a sad way to go through life not understanding other people, not having empathy for them.
As humans, we need different ideas. We can't just have a monolith of everyone thinking the same things. We need to have different backgrounds so that we are better people.
Seattle's really good at talking circles around social problems. Racism, homelessness, you name it, we can talk circles around it. Tackling racism needs to be more than performative.
The country has never lived up to its ideals, ever. It's moved toward its ideals. It's sometimes retreated from its ideals. But if you look at US history, you see that it's deeply embedded this resistance to reaching the ideals that the country was founded on.
When you're a dark man in a country where the Negro is demanding more and more and equal chance, you have the right to look back to discover if you are really moving forward or if the world is just moving beneath your feet.
We're discussing racial equity. The kumbaya days are over.
Put all that politics stuff to the side. Like, this is our life.
Young people are the best way to do anything. Why? Because if you do it right, you're done.
I think it's on our shoulders, it's our responsibility to fight for racial equity.
I think we'll constantly be doing the work of racial equity, and I think we'll constantly be trying to strive for that perfect thing. We may not ever obtain it, but I think it's important to always work towards it.
Your duty is to inspire those coming after you to join in the struggle to define and redefine what is America.
You don't want to be like Tony and I, 68 years old, 50 years later, talking about the same things that we talked about 50 years ago.
I have granddaughters. I tell her every day you walk out this door, go be brilliant and go do something right for somebody else. And it's going to come back to you. And I believe she's going to do that. I keep telling her, you guys are going to get it right one day. I probably won't see it, but I know I put this in you now to go get it right.
If we don't really get involved, I think we're right back at the Kerner Commission again. 2 nations, separate and unequal, 1 black, 1 white. Who wants to live there?
Allison. And really tonight what we'd like to do is hear from you, what your comments are, what your questions are. A little bit of background, this film was finished just about a year ago, and the first showing was at Roosevelt High School. It was still pandemic time, so we had about 500 people in a Zoom watching the initial showing. And then we had a discussion afterward with several panel members. Since then, this film has been placed on our website, and for those of you who are interested and haven't been there before, our website was shown there at the end of the film. If you just Google Roosevelt High School racial equity, you'll find it. And on the website, there's a lot of information about us. And the film is there. There's a page for the film. It has discussion questions, it has a curriculum with it, and you can just click on the film and see it and show it. So our goal was really to get this film out as much as we can. And after that initial showing, it's been showed at a number of different schools in individual classes or for faculty meetings. PTSAs have shown the film quite a few times, and so have religious groups. It's been shown at synagogues and churches, all really not just to see the film, but for discussion. And now we actually got a grant from King County earlier actually last year, to help us push that film further out into the community. The Seattle community, certainly the Roosevelt High School community, Northeast Seattle, but really beyond that. I mean, this film, as you probably know, is relevant not just to Roosevelt, not just to Seattle, but to many cities that experimented with integration and then kind of got resegregated in the same way that Seattle did, partly for economic reasons. So I think we could talk more about Rare, but the history you heard it before the film, that Joan and I got together with a number of classmates of about our era in the summer after George Floyd was murdered. We didn't know how long Rare was going to last. It started as a discussion. Those early meetings were really memorable because we were learning about each other and learning about ourselves. And speaking for the white people, white participants, we learned a lot. And we learned it on a more personal basis. But it was also just good to see folks again that we hadn't seen hardly at all for 50 years, except maybe a reunion. And pretty soon we started to think, do we want to keep this as just a discussion group, because it's great, or do we want to try to do something? We decided to try to do something. And here we are, almost 3 years later. The film was one major project, but we also established 2 annual scholarships at Roosevelt High School for students of color with financial need. We're involved in a number of other projects right now. And we can talk about those more later if you'd like to hear. I don't want to talk too much because Joe always has something to say. And we want to hear from you guys too, but Joe.
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank, this is, like Tony said, we've shown this film and we've had an opportunity to talk to groups in the past, but this is the largest group that we've spoken to, so thank you. Appreciate all the support and the work you're bringing us here. It's, and I've seen the film, I don't know how many times, 15, 20, 30 times, whatever. But every time I see it, it just gets to me, It's personal. And since we've made the film, I've had an opportunity to talk to several of the black students of color alumni from Roosevelt, and you realize how much trauma some of them went through, at Roosevelt, to the point where, 30 and 40 years later, they can still think of some of the experiences they had, experiences that when I went to Roosevelt, I didn't even know about. My experiences weren't that bad at all. But some of them, they just think about it, it's pretty tough. But the challenge that we have is, like Tony said, Rare started with the killing of George Floyd. Okay, and everyone saw it on TV. You saw a black man calling out for his mom after police or the folks in the store suspected him of having a $20 counterfeit bill. And as a result of that, he ended up being killed and what have you. But the challenge that we have is, this thing that we keep talking about in terms of racism, prejudice, biases against anyone that's different. Here we're talking a lot about because of race, but if you're different, because you have a different sexual orientation, or if you're different because you have a different religion, or if you're different because you're short instead of tall, people discriminate you for that. So it's somehow or another we've got to get to the point where we can appreciate the differences in individuals and not try to use that against them simply because they don't look at or believe the same things that we do. And it's not easy. It really isn't. And that's one of the challenges that we have, is coming out and talking to groups like you and getting your point of view in terms of with your life experience and so forth. How can we change things for the next generation? Okay, because there's a lot of life lessons that I've learned here. And talking about racism is not easy. It really isn't easy. Okay, but somehow the majority of you in this room, you've gotten to the point where you're not afraid of it. You're not afraid to talk about it. You're not afraid to talk about things that you've experienced over your lifespan, that you liked, you enjoyed, and things that you didn't like and didn't enjoy. And we've got to get to that point. We've got to get to that point if we're ever going to get to solving this issue that we have in terms of racism in America, and it's here in Seattle. So I have a tendency to talk too much. So
you just borrow this for a second. We have a mic runner, Jean's over there, and we'll share this mic here, and Mary Margaret also has a mic. So let's start with anybody who has a question. I have one. The board of directors for Roosevelt Alumni for Racial Equity. There are 24 people on the board of directors, and it's a huge mix of people, and I'd like to know how you were able to pull that group together and how long it took to convince those people this was a project they needed to get involved in.
The initial group that we were talking about was about 15, 16 people, about half black and half white, but they were mostly our era, right? We were 68 years old at the time. That was the initial board. Since then it's evolved, and it's evolved in a couple of ways. One is that we've been able to attract people who didn't graduate from Roosevelt High School. Because as it showed there in the film, our roots are at Roosevelt. I know, how many of you, 16 of you went to Roosevelt here? Raise your hand if you went to Roosevelt. Yes, Rough Riders. So we love our roots. Those are our roots, but we don't want to stop at Roosevelt High School. We aren't going to stop at Roosevelt High School. So we've been able to attract more people onto the board who maybe didn't go to Roosevelt, maybe aren't even from Seattle. That's great. It's called diversity, and diversity of experience. So the other way we've tried to develop is to get a little bit younger, right? Because we started at 68, now we're 70 almost, and we've been able to get a few people from a younger generation on the board. And if you look at our pictures on the board, you're probably able to tell who those people are. They look a little different than we do. But that's a challenge because younger people are working, usually, they're raising families. So I'm kind of giving a long answer to your question, but it's been a mix of things. We have a committee structure. So typically someone comes in and works on a committee initially, and over time, after they find out about RARE and RARE finds out about them and they get settled, then at that point they may get invited to join the board. I want to say one other thing about the board. We adopted, and this is really Joe's idea, I got to give him credit. We adopted in our bylaws that the board has to be at least 50% people of color and at least 50% non-male, okay? And we did the same thing with our executive committee. And we struggled, but we're hit those targets. We're there now. So Joe, I think the way Joe said it is we gotta walk the talk. We can't just talk about diversity and be a predominantly white organization or something like that. We gotta do it, and it really benefits us, I think, because when we have discussions now, and we still have them, we got diverse voices, and that's really important to us internally. So that was a really long answer to your question, sorry.
Yeah, and I was just going to add that you know, we have a really good board. And, we have a really good board, and you know, one of the things, like Tony said, that we have in our bylaws that at least 50% of our board members have to be people of color, okay, or have to be females, okay. And I want to tell you why we needed to put that in there, okay? Because I've seen it happen in too many corporations where you have good people with good intentions, and then those good people with good intentions leave, okay? And then it's rather than to address things the way they should, they just change the rules. Okay, so that was the reason why I felt that we needed to put in writing. We need to put in writing that was our requirement, and we held ourselves accountable for that. And not only that, again, to protect ourselves from ourselves in the future, because believe it or not, Tony and I, well, we might be here in 20 years, but okay. But believe it or not, you know, we're not going to be able to be doing what we are doing now. So we made it in order to change the bylaws. Okay, in order to change the bylaws, you have to have a supermajority to change it. So they can't just come in and make a change simply because the individuals at the time feel that that's the direction we need to go in. Okay, so, and if you watch the film, a lot of the things that caused a lot of the problems that we've had in the past were legal. They were legal. Okay, so I just wanted to touch on that.
Question here. Right here. Got one over there. The question is the way it's going. It's not a question.
Is it on?
Joe, we don't need somebody here. No, they were first. Go ahead.
Am I on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Stand up.
All right. I'm Ann Irish, and I lived on Vashon Island until a year and a half ago. And I still go over there every so often to volunteer in the Historical Museum. And when I come back here, I walk onto the ferry and then take a C bus to come back to downtown Seattle and then up here. Well, I come back on the 320 ferry, and guess who else is on the 320 ferry? 4 full-size school buses of kids, a high school and junior high school, who live off the island and who live somewhere in South King County probably, and come to Vashon because they or their parents think they'll get a better education or who knows what. But every last one of those people, maybe there's a few that I miss, but they're all white. And to me, that's just another illustration of the problem you're talking about. Why does Vashon want them? Because it's harder and harder to live there if you have kids, and so the schools were losing the students, and so they made it easier for commuting students to come. It doesn't cost the students anything to go to the school. The school gets the money that comes from the state, but the parents have to pay ferry fare, which is not cheap. So anyway, that's just another example of the problem. And I've thought about it a lot when I see all these kids on the boat, and I have no idea what to do about it, but I hope somebody does bring all sorts of kids and not just white ones.
We have another question over here.
Is this film being shown to students? Is it being shown in schools? The film?
Okay, I turned it off.
The answer is yes, but the answer is also not enough. It's been, I mentioned it was shown to the whole school at Roosevelt, or maybe I didn't say that, but it was shown to the community, and then it was shown to the whole school. It's been shown, I think, twice. It was shown last year and this year. And that's kind of an obvious choice. It's been shown at Eckstein, which is a middle school that feeds into Roosevelt. And it's been shown, I can name a few other schools. But what we're really trying to do now is get to be systematic about pushing it out into the schools. Through the PTSAs, through teachers that we have contact. I was a teacher in Seattle Public Schools for a while, so I know some people. So it's working, but it's working slowly. But every time it happens, it gets a good response, a strong response. So we want to keep doing that. I want to share something with you. We have not had any success getting it shown in private schools. And we think that's really important. I do. I think that those schools probably need the film as much as public schools or more. And we don't really know why it seems to be either resisted or ignored, because we have made some efforts. You saw the parts in the film there about the rise of private schools. I taught at a private school before I taught public schools. I taught at University Prep. I don't know if you know, University Prep is right near Roosevelt, and the teachers from Roosevelt went to UPrep and founded that school, and it was right during the beginning of mandatory busing. So what's pointed out in the film is that it's what do you call it? It's a correlation of it. It's not causation, but it certainly was related at the same time. So I think this would be a great thing to debate in the private schools, right? Where are our roots? What's our history? But so far we haven't had. So if any of you are connected to private schools, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of you are, try to get the film shown there. I mean, it's a plus. So that's the answer. I think the most success we've had so far is with PTSA groups, and that's good, and they're connected to the schools, and parents are really an important audience for this film as well. So a little bit more success there. But again, we keep saying this, we're kind of just scratching the surface in terms of where this film could be shown. It was shown 4 times on Channel 9 PBS. I was talking to someone who had seen it on twice last spring and twice this fall. So that certainly expanded the audience.
Yeah, I was just going to add, okay, that 22% of all the school kids in Seattle, okay, go to private schools. Okay, and you know, obviously you can send your kids anywhere you want to go, but the funding for schools is dependent on how many kids you have at that school. Okay, so obviously there's a lot of funding that would ordinarily go to public school that isn't.
Okay, Adele, I'm glad to have the chance to ask you if you're have had any luck in addressing where the funds within the Seattle School District are going. Are they more evenly distributed? And where would you start?
Well, to be honest with you, I'm still learning. I'm still learning.
I think we all are.
Yeah. Okay. And here's what I know, and I'm learning because of a program that RARE is working on in collaboration with the Seattle Public School, and it's called Restorative Practice. In fact, it's Restorative Practice Community Coalition. Okay. And some of you may be familiar with restorative justice. Okay. And they talk about the pipeline from school to prison and how it impacts particularly black males. Okay, but before restorative justice is kind of like a reaction. Restorative practice is a more proactive approach. Okay, so with that, in doing research on that, okay, we've got kind of a 4 or 5 pronged approach. We're trying with this coalition, we're trying to get teachers to join our coalition and to support restorative practice, justice. We're trying to get the principals, we're trying to get students, we're trying to get parents, and we're trying to get the city government and state legislature, everyone involved in it. Because it's not just educating the students or the schools on what needs to be done is to make sure you have the funding for it. So as part of the funding strategy, what we're looking at, 57% of all the funding for public schools comes from the state. Okay, and then you got 15% or so that comes from the city of Seattle. Okay, so the 57%, and again, I'm still learning, but 57%, one of the items that's impacting that is the fact that what they call the special education cap, if you're familiar with that. But that special education cap is, the cap is 13.5%. So what that is, that says if anyone is in this category, needs special help, language or whatever, needs special help, the most funding that a school can receive is 13.5% of the students. Okay? The amount that's actually needed is a lot higher than that. So if schools have a more than that 13.5%, any additional funding that they need has to come from elsewhere. It has to help basically hurt other programs or what have you. The other part, a large part, comes from the city for special programs or whatever. But to answer your question, it's a key part of our understanding in order to get to the root cause of some of the problems that we have, so that we can come up with some long-term solutions. And it's not something you can flip a switch and turn on tomorrow and everything's fixed. You know, right now, 80% of all school teachers are white females. Okay. Now, if you have based on their experience and what have you, one of the issues in schools that are predominantly students of color is that those teachers can't relate to the students of color. They can't relate to them. Okay, and I go back to my experience when I was in first grade. I remember my first grade teacher telling me, "Hey, you're a great student," and I still see visions of that written on the board. Imagine if a teacher told you, "You're never going to be any good. You're not going to be able to be worth anything." What kind of impact that could have on kids, you know, second, third grade, or whatever? They're going to be turned off on it. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to solve the educational system. Some of it's just built into the institution, and we can solve them, but it's going to take a lot of this coalition that we're talking about coming together and taking some action.
Hello. Okay. So I have people in my family of color. One young man was playing basketball in Seattle Public Schools, and it was kind of interesting to me. He originally, where he was living with his dad, he was originally he went to 2 different schools in West Seattle, and he liked one of them. He said one of them, he didn't get like a lot of hassle. The other one, and I can't remember which one, he ended up in Ingram the last 2 years. And he had a pretty good experience. And I was impressed with the variety of kids coming and going. And they love their basketball team. And like we go down to Garfield High School to watch them play. And they really love it. We didn't make it to Roosevelt, did we? I can't remember. But anyway, so it would be good if there were just ways to get more people who don't actually have kids of their own. I mean, this is like, he's my great nephew, kind of. But he's in Seattle, I'm in Seattle, so I was able to go to those games. But, you know, just people not even being exposed. You know, just ways to get people into the schools and kind of cheering the kids when they're together.
Okay, we're going to take one more question.
Well, can I comment on that just real quick?
Donnie, you want to respond to that?
We mentioned new programs that we're working on now. Joe talked just now about restorative practice that we think is really important, could have a really broad impact. And another one is called Connections, and it relates to what you're talking about. What we're doing is running a program that's starting actually in about 10 days at Roosevelt and simultaneously at Garfield. And it is a after-school program on Wednesdays at Roosevelt, Tuesdays at Garfield, for students to come and learn about race and learn how race affects relationships. And then there's the next phase is to combine the two schools. And so this is really important to get kids out of their bubble, right, that they're in their group at school and so forth. There's no more busing, and there's not going to be, for the reasons that the film said, the legal reasons. So we're trying to think about ways to do what you're talking about. Now, as far as adults go, let me just throw out an idea. We were at a synagogue last summer, and we did just what we're doing tonight. It was on Zoom. But as a result of that, and some discussion and questions, the synagogue started to form a relationship with a black church in South Seattle. Just an exchange, kind of like, let's get talking, let's see each other. And I think it's what you're talking about. How do you get out of your own bubble at any stage in life? So I'm just going to fill this out. Crazy idea, right? I know there is a predominantly black residence home in the central area. Joe, you might even know what the neighborhood is, but maybe there's something that Horizon House ought to be doing, could be doing, to mix with places that are less, sorry to put it, homogenous than Horizon House is. Red? Color-wise. Just a thought.
I know we could go on and on, but I had promised that we'd be out of here by 8:45, and in setting up this program, I read everything I could find on their website, and so I think it's really important for you to read all of the programs. The scholarship program is really important. The Young People's Connection program is important. So Marcy, will you stand up? Marcy and Louise have handouts with computer links to their website, so that when you leave here, if you want more information, it's pretty easy to just type into your computer and get all of the information about Roosevelt Alumni for Racial Equity. And we thank you both for what you're doing and for being here and sharing with us tonight.
And white supremacy, question mark, racist, is in your alert this week to read about it. The three names of myself, Adele Reynolds, and Jean Durning, and our phone numbers are in the book. And please call us. We start classes on the 27th and 28th of February. And so it is an opportunity to go deeper, and let's look at where we are and how we can heal ourselves. And I would love to close with, what is a beloved community? The aftermath of violence is bitterness. The aftermath of nonviolence is the creation of a beloved community. So that when the battle is over, a new relationship comes into being. The end is reconstruction. The end is redemption. This is the love that may well be the salvation of our civilization, written by the Honorable Martin Luther King Jr. Thank you again for your attendance, and another round of applause to our